goodness, I'm not quite sure exactly where to begin with this. Well, I guess the beginning might very well be as good a spot as any. Preparation. I had set up a makeshift belt of rations as to allow for eating while in the cave. And while it did turn out to be immensely useful, good gracious, was my suit not made to comfortably accommodate for that extra clunky bit of space. And may I mention, too, how dreadfully bland this food stuff can get after a while. Yes, I understand these are usually meant as emergency supplies, but for goodness sake, could they at least add a little bit of seasoning? After slurping up this unashamedly bland paste for so long, I'm starting to think even the rocks outside could be more appetizing. There'd be some texture, at least. That big sample container I had on my back didn't help with things either. Anyway, with the food issue taken care of, the only major thing I needed to worry about was actually heading out there at the right time. When the time was right, I, with only relatively minor inconvenience, donned my suit and headed out for my hour-long journey to the spire once more. May I say again that it's indeed so much nicer moving around in this lower gravity environment. I know I've mentioned this before, but the added mobility really does mean a good bit when you're having to deal with it every moment of each and every day. At first, it was a bit of a pain to get accustomed to the new weight compensation, but now it's become quite enjoyable, making leisurely strides while also not tiring so quickly. Not to mention that carrying things has also become that little bit easier, given that everything has had about an eighth of their usual weight taken off. Indeed, the trip back to the spire was altogether pleasant given the circumstances. Having yet another opportunity to observe the crystalline structure, I hypothesized that given the overabundance of silicon-rich rocks we've seen before, our dear spire is in fact also made of a similar silicate-type material. Speaking on that, during the expedition I finally took some small samples of the spire, along with some other things which I will discuss later, and said samples are currently being analyzed by the computer as we speak. Soon enough we can finally get to the bottom of this question of composition. Oh, also a day or two ago I had mentioned the high likelihood of molten activity below the surface, though I'd still not seen any clear activity above ground, besides the occasional minor tremor. The thought of potentially facing a much more intense thermal environment below ground was, to say the least, quite on my mind. Especially as I was getting further, I won't deny I felt a good bit of anxiety for what may be down below. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. Finally reaching the spire, I inspected the enormous crack in the ground that had developed from the structure's base. I checked to make sure that said opening would be large enough so that I could fit through and properly begin the spelunking. Lengthwise, this opening stretched about 4 body lengths from the spire. I shined my light down, and, fortunately enough, it did appear sufficiently deep enough to fit my body in with room to spare. Estimating, I would say it was about 3 body lengths deep. By how the crack seemed to smoothly develop from the spire, I would say this opening was likely formed as our giant crystal had gradually broken through the upper crust. This meant that instead of a sudden jolt from a plate shifting, this crack formed over the millennia that the spire took to reach its current height. This very well might not even be as tall as it's going to get. Given the average speed of most geological development, though, I will more than likely not be able to see whether my hypothesis is supported or not, sadly enough. By this point, I had climbed down to the bottom of the opening. Looking at the submerged section of the crystal spire that I could see, it was clear its end was nowhere in sight. Looking to the other side, I quickly discovered yet another cavernous opening. This, dear listeners, is what allowed me to delve further below. Climbing into this lower entrance, I found myself in a gently descending tunnel that would occasionally turn in various directions in a somewhat erratic manner, making maneuvering a bit of a pain at times. Luckily enough, though, I still had vastly sufficient space to move around unabated. There was little worry of grazing my suit against the likely sharp tunnel walls. Oh, I'd forgotten to mention, this tunnel I'd found myself in was encrusted with countless crystals, each no bigger than my eye. They all seemed of the same make as our dear spire up above, all whitish in color, with a rectangular prism structure. What I found truly awe-inspiring, though, was the effect of my light as it shone against the walls. Everywhere I could see, there glistened brilliant stars. It was like being inside of a geode. No, an underground cosmos in itself. From these experiences, I have come to surmise that this tunnel was very likely formed from a long-deceased lava tube, a channeling of lava from a high-pressure environment to a lower-pressure one, tending towards an upward direction. This lava tunnel would have thus developed towards the opening our spire had produced as it had first broken through the ground. This tunnel would be then opened up yet again in what would be a relatively short, if you could describe a geological period of millennia as short, period of time, as the spire continued to grow upwards and enlarge the opening. My evidence of this comes from the relatively tiny size of the crystals, as they would have likely only had the proper time and conditions to develop properly when the lava tube was still closed off from the cooler atmosphere above ground. Now again, I must emphasize that these developments would have been over thousands of years, but in the time frame of the spire's ascension, this tunnel's formation would have seemed a mere instant. Now, as I was saying, it was because of all these fortunate circumstances that I was in fact able to even explore further down below. I think that run of serendipity is pretty neat, if I do say so myself. As I had expected, after roughly an hour of descending, my suit sensors began to detect a general increase in ambient temperature. I was far enough down below ground to be sure there was enough material between myself and the sun for it to have no real effect on the current temperature. So, more than likely, this increase of ambient heating was coming not from above, but rather from further below. The larger and more developed crystals I was finding testified to this potentially proximate magmatic activity. Also, by this point, I should mention that as the tunnel gradually descended, so too did my general worries and caution increase as well. Obviously, given I am currently able to recount this story, I was able to make it back in one piece. But still, all throughout my time down there, I was incredibly wary of what could quickly have become my swift demise at any moment. All anxiety aside, I did manage to continue on, and my goodness, am I glad I did. Within no less than a seventh of an hour more, I found myself at an entrance to a much larger cavern. At first I had found myself in yet another tunnel, but as I moved my light around to see my surroundings, I discovered I was in somewhere else altogether. It was far more magnificent than anything I would have expected coming down here. All around me were an array of the most complex and mesmerizing crystals I had ever seen, stretching on and on to a point my light could not even reach. And my goodness, these crystals were not the pipsqueaks I saw before in the tunnels, no. These made even our spire up above seem like a plaything. Following my predictions early on, I indeed found more crystals in this cavern, some even growing through the ceiling to points where I very likely would have seen up above ground. My stars, the sheer size difference from what I had seen beforehand was simply stupefying. I'm not sure I could even give an appropriate estimate to the size of most of these spectacles of grandeur. The ones I could reach, given the sudden drop a few body lengths ahead of me, were easily 3 to 4 times the diameter of our original spire. Given the distance and sheer enormity of the cavern, I would not be surprised to find growths even larger than these. My goodness, were the arrangements of these behemoth structures so abnormal. The way these crystals developed and organized themselves seemed far too efficient to have occurred from random assortment. Yes, I understand I may sound like some sort of pseudo-science fiction type nut, but even natural crystal formations and patterns have a limit to what they can achieve. This seems like more. The extreme efficiency of the organization of these structures, how each one overlaps and aligns with one another so perfectly as to never run into one another, even when meeting at the most odd angles, just did not sit right with me. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying there was some grand entity lining up these crystals, or any such silly and fantastical contrivances like that. But surely there must have been some better explanation to this absurdly efficient development than mere random chance. Circuitry. That's what the arrangements looked best like now that I think about it. The crystals organized themselves in units and nodes, as far as I could see, with lines of smaller crystals running from node to node. Maybe these crystals developed following some sort of pattern of hotspots even further below. Now that I think of it too, I could swear I saw sudden flashes of light down there. At first I thought it was just trick of my eyes after being in the dark for so long. But now, maybe such organizations could also collect enough heat energy to produce such effects as moments of light. Perhaps the light came from discharges of electricity? Now I just don't know. At this point, I'm only brainstorming here, so forgive the somewhat wild guesswork. Anyhow, I should get on with the story. Trying to take in every sight I could, I searched for a way to possibly go even further down into the cave, given the temperature did not rise too much more. Unfortunately, it appeared that the area that I entered into was merely a natural platform. To both my left and right there were gigantic crystal protrusions barring my way. Given that I also did not even want to think of attempting to climb down that sheer drop ahead of me, I decided after some lengthy contemplation that this platform would be the place to end my journey downward for now. I still had roughly half a home day left to wait until I could return to my vessel, so I began preparing for my extended wait. Quickly finding a suitable spot near the entrance to rest, I went to work collecting crystal samples from varying locations of interest with my suit's handy mini-drill. After storing these samples in the detachable container I'd brought along, I set myself down in my resting area and waited. Fortunately, I had these magnificent crystals to keep me company down here. Eventually, though, I did have to turn my lights off as to conserve energy for my trip back up, leaving myself to unsuccessfully try to rest for the remaining time. Eventually, the hour to leave came. I finished off my leftover rations and began my lengthy ascent. Reaching the surface and making the return trip back was uneventful. Though it was nice to bring some physical proof of my excursion, the added weight did make for the trip to be just that bit more of a hassle. However, the thought of how valuable these samples may be scientifically did make the load seem just a bit lighter. With that, we come to the end of my grand excursion. After setting up my procured samples into the analyzers and otherwise getting into the right frame of mind, I set myself down to record the latest log, and here we are. I must say, I'm incredibly excited to see what these samples may say, of the origin of the cave and of all these gargantuan crystals I have found. Time will only tell, though, as such analysis will easily take a good while to reach any kind of conclusion. Speaking of which, I myself am incredibly tired, and ready to finally rest on some actual bedding. Many thanks as always to all those listening in, and I wish you all best of luck on your pursuits in science. Until next time.
End of log.